Welcome to our August Buzz Pick of the Month author event. We're thrilled to have Laura Lippman and Sarah Weinman here to talk about Laura's latest book, Dream Girl. But first, let's get to know them both a little bit better. Since her debut in 1997, Laura Lippman has been hailed as a distinctive voice in crime fiction. She's an award-winning New York Times-bestselling author of 24 novels and has produced short stories, essays, and a children's picture book. Laura's 2019 novel, Lady in the Lake, will also be produced as a television series. Sarah Weinman is the author of The Real Lolita and the editor, most recently, of Unspeakable Acts, True Tales of Crime, Murder, Deceit, and Obsession. Weinman writes the crime column for the New York Times Book Review and is a 2020 National Magazine Award finalist for reporting. Dream Girl is on sale now and available at your local independent bookstore. Visit indiebound.org to find an indie in your area. Throughout the conversation today, feel free to use the Q&A box to send in a question. We'll have a Q&A portion towards the end with some of the questions here and those submitted at your registration. Closed captioning is also available at the bottom of your screen. On behalf of Indie Book Buzz and Bookfinity, thank you so much for joining us today. And remember to follow Indie Book Buzz on Instagram and visit bookfinity.com for the latest BuzzPick news. And now we're pleased to virtually welcome Sarah Weinman and Laura Lippman.
Hello.
Hey, how are you?
It's so great to be talking with Laura for this wonderful audience full of independent booksellers and others in the book trade. I remember when I first read Dream Girl months ago, just being completely blown away and rereading it. It was just being in that moment and always being excited because you never write the same book twice. And, you know, that in itself is just kind of a marvel. But my first question that I wanted to get into is actually something that the Washington Post critic and the NPR Fresh Air critic, Maureen Corrigan, pointed out, which is that Dream Girl is part of this grouping of crime novels and novels sort of adjacent to crime that have to do with like the anxiety of influence and writers taking ideas and manuscripts from other writers. And there's something that she said, which I think is like really interesting, that these books are about the anxiety of appropriation, about one character in a position of privilege in terms of gender, financial security, or race, laying their sticky mitts on the writing or life story of another character who's not so advantaged. So what I wondered is that what you started with Dream Girl, or did that come later, or how did that get folded in?
I mean, I started on that before Dream Girl. It's very much the question at the heart of Lady in the Lake, which I wrote as almost this meta exercise of, I mean, I think we all know the line about every writer knows what they do. What is it? Is
Selling
unconscionable or selling someone out. It's like, it's indefensible. I think that's,
yeah.
And
well, it's like Didion was selling somebody out and Janet Malcolm was calling it morally indefensible, but yeah.
That was it. That was it. And, you know, I always read that by Malcolm, as Malcolm was struggling with her issues. She was struggling with being sued, and how do you defend what you do? I mean, how do you defend life as a writer? As someone who teaches, I do tell students, if you can be happy without doing this, if you can be truly happy without writing, go do that, because writing leads you to this wonderful but interior and kind of secondhand life. You spend a lot of time thinking, how would I describe that? How can I use that? Can I use that? And as someone who had been working for years with inspiration from real life crimes, I really began wrestling with, is that fair? Is that right? How does that affect the people who know the true story, who are involved in the true story? And I couldn't get to the point where I was like, this is absolutely wrong. But I definitely got to the point where it was like, this is something that needs to be done with a lot of sensitivity and a lot of awareness. So I started in Lady in the Lake, just, you know, straight up, there's a character at the center of that novel, and she wants to write about someone who died because that will serve her ambition. And people could project that onto me. They could say, you wrote about these real stories, you use them for novels, and, you know, how do you sleep at night? I think some people have actually challenged me on that and said that and, you know, people are so interested in the idea that ideas are special and that they can be owned. And when you're a writer, you don't feel that way at all. When you're a writer, everything's about execution. There's a marvelous book out this year called The Plot, also dealing with a lot of this stuff. And
dealing with it in such a different way than Dreamgirl is.
And I mean, The Plot made me feel like a little bit of a sociopath, because I was like, I'd steal an idea in a heartbeat. The person died, they didn't get to write it. I mean, I think about the faculty members of Eckert, Stuart Onan, Anne Hood, Andre Dubus III. If we were sitting up one night and someone had a great idea and later one of us died, I don't think any of us would mind if someone in that room then took the idea and ran with it, because it would be different. But in Dreamgirl, I was really interested in a certain kind of man. And Sarah, you and I know these men.
Oh, yes.
We
definitely do.
Capital W, capital G, white guy who's smart enough not to say a lot of stuff out loud, but very baffled. And they see themselves as standing up for ideas and purity and principles. It's like, they're not sexist, they're not against change, but language is language. And how dare we not defend the language? How dare we let the language change just because it offends someone's sensibilities? And talent is talent. And who are we to say that maybe white men are just not disproportionately more talented than the rest of us? How dare you think that as a teacher, a man might pay more attention to a beautiful woman than a plain one? I just was so interested in that person. And I wanted him to be really smart, in almost good company. Like, I wanted him to be someone that maybe I could almost be friends with if I was friends with literary writers, which I seldom am. No, actually, I like most of the literary writers I've met. But I wanted to write about this man in crisis. And I wanted to write about memory and the fear of dementia, bodily hubris. And it was just like, this was the opportunity. And, I just started wanting to write sort of a horror novel in a big city. Like, what's it like to be in isolation in a city? And it's so weird that this is what I was thinking about at the end of 2018. But I had a feeling that for a lot of people, they were lonelier than they knew. And that a single event could illustrate for them just how very alone they were in the world.
And boy, are we ever finding out the depths of loneliness.
Yeah.
I was sort of going through mentally all of your work, and obviously you've written from a male POV before, sort of short bursts, but never like the sustained thing with Jerry. So what was it like being in his head this whole time?
Well, it was better than being in the head of a serial killer, which I've done. Jerry's head is a pretty claustrophobic place, but that suited the novel well because it's a claustrophobic novel. I did feel that I had the advantage of, I don't think I have empathy for Jerry, but I get it. I get it. I was like, okay, this is your life and this is how it could mold you. Other people could have been molded differently. Jerry lacks empathy, I think, and doesn't realize that he lacks empathy, even for people he adores, like his mother.
He thinks he's self-aware and he's exceedingly unself-aware.
But how many people do we know like this?
Right.
It's so crazy. Going back to that appropriation question, and I've said this before in public forums, it's an important discussion. We have to have it. We have to talk about it. And I've come very firmly down on, do what you want, but you have to be prepared to fail at it. You have to be prepared for feedback that you failed at it. You really have to listen to what happens once you do this. By the way, I haven't had any men come forward and tell me that I don't understand men, but if they want to, I'll listen.
Can you imagine?
I'm totally open to that. I feel like I've spent my entire adult life making a study of this kind of man. I think that's something women do because we have to get along with them. We have to work with them. We have to deal with them. But I am so tired of this glib whatever happened to imagination, and I write about firefighters and I'm not a firefighter. To pretend that a profession is equivalent to an ethnicity, to, you know, being a person who's not cisgendered, it's not the same thing. It's really different. I mean, Sarah, I was in sort of, I won't call it a moral panic, but last night I put on the movie A Mighty Wind, which I love, and it's, you know, it's very gentle. But
does it not work anymore?
I think the joke at the end that the one character is transitioned doesn't work anymore. The you know, Harry Shearer in a dress is supposed to be funny. I can't find that. I mean, it's, I guess the joke, can I put in quotes, was that he transitions, but he doesn't really seem to transition except for putting on a dress. It's just a really cheap and insensitive joke in a very subtle and lovely movie, which is so smart about people and folk music. And it made me really sad.
Because it just goes to show that even with such attention and care, you can just completely misfire because you're not paying attention at all. And you can
things age out. I mean, that movie's almost 20 years old.
Right.
And, you know, so at the time, most people would not have thought twice. I mean, again, and then this other thing about these guys, you know, they're like, I can't make jokes anymore. But so many of the jokes that people can't make anymore were just bad jokes.
Right.
I mean, I really pay attention when I'm watching old comedies from the early part of the 21st century. It's like, that's just a lazy joke. It's not like it's this great daring joke. I also just finished watching The Chair over the weekend. And I was like, one of the things that's interesting to me about The Chair is I still don't understand why Bill said Heil Hitler. I was like, what? What? I mean, it was some point about Camus and Beckett fighting against fascism. So why did he say, and it's so interesting that that's the one thing the show never explains, is why he even thought that was a joke. What, I mean, he's drunk and he's in grief, but what's he going for? Anyway, yeah, I'm not done with these ideas.
No, I mean, I can feel it. It's like this as a thematic thing, I think is going to keep coming up. But something else that you've been doing as sort of an ongoing project with the standalones is having them be in conversations with books that you read and loved. So I know you've talked about Misery, and I do want to hear a little bit more about that, but I was actually really curious, and you've also talked about Philip Roth's and the Zuckerman. It's so weird to call it the Zuckerman series, but it kind of is. Let's be real here.
Yeah, it is.
But I know you also mentioned Margaret Mitchell Ducour's a novel called Heritage, and I think that's one that I myself know very little about, and maybe the audience also knows little about. So what about that was particularly appealing for Dreamgirl?
Well, basically, I stole the last major twist in the novel from it. I did. And I mean, if it were, I mean, it's sort of it's bittersweet. I mean, the book won an award. I think it won the William, I should know. It won a big prize. It was well reviewed, and it's out of print. And it never had the readership it deserved. I read a remaindered copy that my sister, who worked in a bookstore, an independent bookstore, by the way, Remington's of Baltimore, she, you know, gave me the remaindered copy after they tore the cover off the paperback, and that's how I came to read it. It's a very funny book. You should search it out, Sarah. I think you would really like it. And it's very self-aware. You know, it's this young, very young woman. She's still a teenager, I believe, trying to write the story of her crazy family and just badgering this New York editor who doesn't really want her pages, but she just keeps sending them. And so it's letters and these scraps of a novel, and it made a big impression on me, and I really cared about it. But yeah, I mean, since 2016, when I published Wild Lake, after years of being very influenced by real life crimes that were from like my youth, I was suddenly like, I want to talk back to all these books that are important to me. And, you know, Dreamgirl, I was really proud of this. Susan Larson, who's former books editor of the New Orleans Times-Picayune and has her own show in New Orleans about books on the radio. she interviewed me a couple weeks ago, and she said she started making a list of the literary illusions in Dreamgirl, and she stopped at 150. And
Wow.
I had no idea there were that many, but it made me very happy that I had done that, because
I did not notice 150. I mean, at a certain point, it's like you have to just enjoy the narrative as the narrative.
Well, I mean, it's our language. I mean, Sarah, you probably make 150 literary allusions in the course of a typical day. I mean, it's how we talk, right?
True.
So it's what we know. Again, writers live these very quiet, cloistered lives, or they should. I'm definitely a fan of the Flaubert's advice, like, to live like the bourgeoisie, so you can be, violent and original
In your work.
In your work. Yeah, I'm a big believer in that.
Well, so that actually goes into my next question, because one book that you overtly reference, but I think don't make too much of a deal about it, it was Josephine Tey's The Daughter of Time.
Oh yeah.
Which I reread not long ago because I'm trying to figure out, someday I'm going to write a full piece on Tey, because she's just one of the greatest crime writers there ever was. And for the golden age, somehow just doesn't get as much attention, even though there's a wonderful biography about her. But this isn't the first time you've referenced Daughter of Time. So,
I mean, I love that. I just love that setup so much, because I obviously did in Girl in the Green Raincoat, which also had these Rear Window echoes. And I will say that when people talk about Rear Window in connection to Dreamgirl, I don't really see it, because Jerry hasn't seen anything and he's not trying to do anything.
No, if anything, he's like questioning what he has seen, and he's hallucinating or thinking he's seen things, but really not.
In his apartment, he's not observing something across the way. Jerry is too incurious about other people to actually notice somebody murdering his wife across the courtyard. He'd never pick up on that. And he wouldn't, he'd draw his blinds and be like,
that's like the unwritten scene of Dreamgirl.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I like all sorts of challenges. I'm constantly, I mean, sometimes I just make challenges up for the heck of it. And in Dreamgirl, I love, and in Girl in a Green Raincoat, I love this challenge of, can you write a book that feels like a page turner, even though the main character's in bed the whole time? And of course, Tey did it so beautifully, and you can't pretend to be doing it first or best, but you can, tip your hat and try different versions of it.
But is that also why Tess Monahan figures in a really pivotal scene? Or is it just like, you want to bring Tess back because bringing Tess back is always the best?
Jerry needed a private detective. And she had recently been profiled in Baltimore Magazine. I think that was, I know there's a line in there that he's read all of his New Yorkers finally. Yeah. That's how bedridden he is. And he's now started on Baltimore Magazine. And he seemed like this, it just seemed to me to be classic Baltimore. This is how Jerry, of course, Jerry wouldn't just like, well, first of all, who has the Yellow Pages anymore? How would Jerry find a private detective?
Google private detective Baltimore? Like,
yeah, really? And what would you come up with? So I think he was like, oh, he sees this woman and she's in a magazine and she seems pretty reliable. And Jerry likes women, obviously. And I think he's very drawn to the fact that she's female and he likes her. He likes her the minute he meets her. How could he not? And, it was, I really don't think I do a lot of inside jokes or inside baseball. But Baltimore is so small in a sense that to me, this was actually what would have happened. That it just would have worked out that way. So, and it was fun to have Tess show up in the novel and kind of tell Jerry off. Tess is never.
I mean, she has the best line in the book, which is essentially that she's not going to take on a client who lies to himself.
Yeah. She's never been more my alter ego than in that moment, where she can just look at someone and say, well, actually, again, I would never say that. I would just think it and make an excuse and leave. But Tess doesn't. She's like, I can't do this. And, I liked also being able to talk about the fact that these high rises that are going up around Baltimore, and which I guess are good for property values, they can't hide the fact that so many jobs have been displaced in the city and so many people are out of work and sort of kind of There are people in Baltimore who still have work, they don't even show up in jobless statistics anymore because they've stopped trying. They've been trying so long to find work. So I liked being able to do that too. I want to write another Tess novel. I just can't figure out what it is. I will though. I will.
Well, whenever you do, I think a lot of people watching us tonight would be particularly excited. There was one question that I got, which I kind of incorporated into talking about it. But, one last thing with Tess is just, I wonder if by writing her in a supporting role in other books and having her seen through the eyes of others, it was very weird for me to have her viewed from a male gaze, especially one so frankly toxic as Jerry's.
Yeah. I mean, and that was, again, talking about, people know me. People I've been saying for years that older men really like me and they size me up, and it's all about my biceps and how I could, basically put them on and off the toilet and be an unpaid nursemaid. So I was having fun with that. I've increasingly, now I have to there's the title story of my short story collection that's out next year is Tess seen from somebody else's point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And she takes up a good part of that story, and she's working as a private eye and she's doing a good job. And it's about Tess still not being able to always save people, which that was interesting because in that story, she's seen from the point of view of a teenage girl who actually really badly needs saving, but doesn't trust any adult to help her out. So it is fun to kind of stand outside of Tess and see her. I miss being in her head because that's a fun place to be, inside Tess Monahan's head. Yeah. I mean, she's great company, and she's, oh my God. I mean, it's 25 years next year that Baltimore Blues came out. I mean, my relationship with Tess is longer than any marriage I've had. And it's, longer than a lot of my friendships. I mean, this is my imaginary friend who's been with me all this time. And I didn't stop writing about her because I got tired of her. I found it increasingly difficult to create suspenseful stories about someone with a kid because I have a kid and there are a lot of chances I don't take. And there are a lot of things I wouldn't forgive Tess for doing at this point because she has a kid and she has to behave differently. As you know, this year, I wrote it last summer, when a children's magazine approached me about writing a piece for children, I wrote about Tess's daughter. Yeah. And I would dearly love to write children's chapter books about Tess's daughter, but there are only so many hours in the day.
So I also want to talk a little bit about the other women in Jerry's life throughout the duration of Dream Girl. You have his assistant, Victoria, and the night nurse, Aileen. And I guess I just wanted to sort of hear a little bit more, not only in terms of how Jerry sees them, each of them, but also how the reader is supposed to kind of take what they're doing, and especially as things transpire, how their personalities kind of change over the course of the book.
Well, I mean, one thing I was really interested in going into this book, I mean, you and I, we share a lot of friends. That's just a fact. Yes. And a lot of those friends are quite young. They're millennials. And because I know them and because they're gentle with me, I've had an education about boomer privilege that I think a lot of people in my generation would really do well to have, to sort of have this view on the world of younger people and what their work lives are like and what their just day-to-day lives are like. That's very humbling, because you really do realize that just through the mere fact of when you were born, you had this enormous advantage. Yes. Which I kind of knew, but I didn't really think, but now I think about it a lot more. So I was having fun with sort of these generational tensions. One of the things, I mean, we talked about Misery being an influence on this book, but in Misery, Annie Wilkes, it was like, I'm your #1 fan. In Jerry's life, the night nurse walks in and she's like, I don't read.
Right.
I don't read.
Which I love that you just kind of dispense. It's like, okay, you think that it's a Misery here? It's like, she doesn't read.
I don't read. I'm not interested. And Victoria also seems to be a little bit scattered. I mean, she's insisted that she doesn't want to be a writer, which is why he's hired her. And so for those two characters, it's very much generational. You know, him dealing with these much younger people who are different from he is. And you also get a glimpse of what Jerry was like as a teacher when he would have been teaching millennials, because we're talking about in the teens, 2013, I think, maybe 2012, and all of that. So those characters, it's really as much about their age as it is about the fact that there's these women that he's dependent on, even though he can't really stand either of them. And they're the series of wives, one of whom we see almost nothing of.
And that's by design.
Yeah.
What made you decide that these were the wives that we needed to hear more of, and these were the ones we didn't?
Well, I think I wanted to bring forward, I was in Jerry's marital history. I always talk about these things as if I didn't make them up. Jerry's marital history is interesting to me because he starts off with another writer, a very talented writer, a writer who I would say consensus in their writing program is she's the more talented writer, but she's a poet. And it's harder for a poet to have commercial success that Jerry eventually enjoys. And she seems to be kind of interesting and high strung. And is the end of the marriage inevitable because of her conditions and temperament? Well, that's what Jerry tells us. I mean, I think if we got to see her in present day, we would feel very differently about this, because obviously Jerry tells every story wrong. And then I liked pitting him against, in his second wife, someone who was about making money at a time when a lot of people were about making money. You know, when that was a very real tension, 80s into the 90s. And then the third wife is the Cypher, who's just like, at that point, you really do understand that at this point, Jerry is just now gathering trophies. And the only thing he seems to have learned over the course of his life is, oh, maybe I don't have to marry all these. Maybe I could, and he gets involved with Margot, who, I'm not going to say I like Margot.
She fascinates me. I think every time Margot would show up, it was like, I'm Barbara Stanwyck and I'm going to choose some scenery. Like, it was very much
interesting, you know?
like, well, she's almost from another era.
I mean, she's an expensive woman. She's really clear about who she is. I mean, she's basically, men are gigs to her. And she's a good employee. I mean, I think that's one of the things that, and Jerry almost gives her her due, but not entirely. But this is a beautiful, smart woman who can function in any kind of milieu. You know, she can be around, you know, super bookish people. She could be around finance people. She just requires a lot of upkeep. And she doesn't leave until she gets her golden parachute.
Right.
And, you know, and her view of things is Jerry has broken the covenant. He's supposed to take care of her until another man comes along to take care of her. And she's just refusing. I mean, she's, you know, kind of Bartleby the Scrivener, right?
Right. I will stay put.
No, I'm sorry, I'm going to stay in your apartment. Oh, you kicked me out of your apartment. Maybe I'll try to figure out how to move in here. And, you know, she's trouble. And she's the most interesting kind of trouble. I mean, I think I always laugh about this. I once spoke to, I think it might have been just 2 years ago, I spoke to Art Taylor's class at George Mason about Lady in the Lake. And one of the students said, and it just made me laugh so hard because it sounded so much meaner than I think he meant it. And it was like, because you seem to be really interested in beautiful women. Why do you think that is?
What was your answer?
Well, my answer was that I was interested in beautiful women because for so much of history, beauty has been women's primary currency.
Yeah.
It's been what they've derived their power from and what they've used for gain. And so if I'm writing about power dynamics, beauty, especially in a book set in the 1960s, what was going to, help Maddie or Cleo come out ahead was always going to be their looks would tip the scales in their favor. And even that wasn't quite enough. So, Margot fascinates me because I have seen people like that from a distance. I've read about them in certain biographies. And they really are fascinating. There really are people like that who just seem to kind of float on the surface of life and are very good at getting what they want and never taking no for an answer. I mean, I would like to be Margot for a day. I think that would be really fun.
I feel like if I were Margot for a day, it would terrify me so much that I would like not recover for years. But I think it's also, just to kind of lead into the next thing, is that, so much of Dream Girl is about, self-delusion. And I think, and you've said this before, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about it, that Jerry just views himself as a good guy. And that's the most dangerous assumption of all. So I wanted to hear more about how you arrived at that and how you were working with that.
So yeah, I have said that a lot. So now I'll tell the part of the story that I don't think I've ever told. And I'm wondering why I was so reluctant. Part of it is because it may feel like, speaking ill of the dead, but Baltimore for a long time had a woman who is called the Mother Teresa of Baltimore, a woman named B. Gaddy, who helped feed and shelter homeless people. And at the time I was covering poverty and social services. So when I went to spend a couple of days with her, I wasn't looking for any gotcha moments. I thought she was the Mother Teresa of Baltimore. And B sat there in front of me and she opened all her mail and it was just cash and cashier checks and people just sent money in to her. And she counted up all the money and then she took some aside and she's like, well, my phone bill's really high this month, so I'm going to pay my phone bill with this. Like, it was like, this is like, I watched someone who supposedly was running a nonprofit basically violate the law right in front of me. And I worked on this story for a long time. It was really difficult getting into the paper. They didn't want to publish it. And I believe they only did because one of my colleagues, who is like the great conscience of the paper, Scott Shane, who went on to the New York Times, stood up for me. And also, I don't think anyone could believe that someone would be this flagrant. And I thought about Bea all the time, about how in Bea's mind, she was beyond reproach because she was a good person. And she did do good things, but she didn't do them according. I know I ended up getting her investigated by the IRS. And a colleague one time who interviewed her brought back the audio to me years later, in which Bea, I guess, inevitably speculated that I was a racist to question her goodness. And I think that really left a mark on me. I've never talked about this in public. It happened, over 25 years ago. And I was so struck because to me, that's more interesting than being evil. Like if someone was just like an evil genius who was
evil geniuses are boring because they're not, they have no inner anything.
They're just like, I just want to make money. But when someone becomes real, and obviously Mother Teresa herself was pretty problematic. I happened to interview Christopher Hitchens about his documentary on Mother Teresa. Yeah. Yes. But he was right about Mother Teresa in a lot of ways. And the idea of people who cloak themselves in goodness and believe it, if it's an act, I'm not interested. If it's just like someone trying to get over on you, someone trying to scam you, that's not interesting to me, because at the end of the day, they know what they're doing. But, people who think they're good do so much harm in the world. And I don't even remember why I started looking at some of my old books, probably because I was cleaning my office. And I looked back at a book that was published actually 10 years ago this month, The Most Dangerous Thing.
Yeah.
And that was a book where I was really interested in the fact that, and this is, I've got a baby, I've barely been a parent, but I became very interested in the idea about how do you advocate for your own child in a way that doesn't hurt someone else's kid. And it was inspired by a true life scandal over a girl who sued her school board because she didn't get to be valedictorian. And these cases have continued. There was one in the New York Times this summer, which is fascinating. And all parents kind of know this, which is like, oh, you get your school assignment as close to the opening day of school as possible because the school doesn't want you to complain about your kid's teacher. What do you do if your kid gets the bum teacher? And if you can successfully move your kid to the good teacher's class, does that mean a kid gets kicked into the bum? Like, it's really hard to move through this world as a good person without doing harm.
Yeah.
This is very strange. And if you believe you're good, if you're not wrestling with how do I achieve things for myself and my family and my loved ones without hurting others, but if you're just like, well, I'm a good person, I couldn't possibly hurt anyone, man, you're gonna wreak so much havoc. They're like hurricanes,
Right.
like it's like if the hurricane like moves up the shore saying people need water and wind. I really see a need for water and wind. Let me just dump it on them. I'm just doing a great thing.
So just a couple of questions before we'll turn it over to some audience stuff. One is, you mentioned before that Jerry teaches, and he teaches at Goucher College, which you yourself have taught. Was the syllabus that Jerry taught, is that the one you did?
No, because I was teaching straight up creative writing and I didn't have any reading assignments. I had more fun creating that. I
was
can't
gonna
believe someone's
say.
not teaching that class, other than the fact that it's overly too many white men on there. It's really a pretty cool class, right? Comparing,
I would totally sign up for that class.
I think it would be I maybe think it would really be interesting to read Red Baker and watch season 2 of The Wire, because they take very different approaches. One is taking this, Robert Ward took this incredibly human scale view of someone losing work. And, The Wire season 2 is more about the systemic changes that cause that. And also this is, I think it's okay for me to say this. One of the nicest things is, it was important to me that Stephen King publicly said nice things about this book on Twitter.
That was very good.
What was really fun is that we then had a few, DMs about Ghost Story.
Oh,
I love the book Ghost Story so much. It meant a lot to me that Emma Straub read the book, novelist, but also amazing bookstore owner, and also the daughter of Peter Straub who read it. And the movie's so horrible, but I don't see how it could have been good. I don't think you can do in a movie what he did, which is that pervasive sense of dread and fear through suggestion that things are just really terrible and really awful and really scary. And I really had fun writing the conversation between Jerry and the night nurse about how she feels like all the men in Ghost Story should die. And she's not wrong.
no.
Right? They were all murdered her. Why does Fred Astaire get to live just because he's Fred Astaire?
Probably that's exactly why. So I guess the last thing that I want to know is, how pissed would Jerry be to be in a genre novel? And the reason I ask that is because, like, he's so snobbish about the genre. Like, there's this line where he's like, the crime novelist Elmore Leonard, whom Jerry respected about as much as he could respect any genre writer. Naturally, that's the line that made me laugh the most.
Okay, so I should, first of all, full disclosure, there are a lot of literary novelists who really do respect genre and are cool with it and get it. But there are also many who have somehow absorbed this idea that genre is lesser. And if something is genre, it's not literary. The idea that it could be both. I mean, like, have you heard of Reese's Peanut Butter Cups? You can have two great ideas in one. And of course, the thing that makes me crazy is when someone who feels that they're a mainstream literary writer, even someone very well-intentioned, decides to write a genre novel And like, even the ones who like it will then say, but, and then they will explain how they broke the rules of the genre. And it is inevitably by doing something that genre writers have been doing for years. Like, well, I didn't write a whodunit. Oh my God, have you? I'm sorry, there's so many non-whodunits. So they're like, well, I didn't answer all the questions. And you just like, forehead smack. So, I mean, I always like to go back to this Nick Hornby essay that was in his Believer column, and it was about Mystic River. So it's, I'm not talking about myself, but what Hornby said was, he's like, well, if a novel does everything that you would expect a novel to do in terms of telling an engaging, beautifully written story, and on top of that, it meets genre requirements, it's like angels dancing on the head of a pin. Like, is it not actually, I mean, Sarah, you and I could probably talk an hour over why we don't like the phrase transcending the genre, which people mean,
I'm sorry, if for those in the audience who didn't see me eye roll.
I mean, it's just if it's wrong-headed, it's the wrong description, because it's not a plane that we levitate above. And I think the more helpful and interesting way to think about fiction is to think of it as a map of these vague, not well-charted territories. And the coolest stuff is always happening in these borderlands.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I'm over here, and look, there's Daniel Waddell and Megan Abbott, and I'm not really sure which side of the fence I'm on, and I don't need to know. These are just super cool books, and I love reading them. And I think that's true whether literary fiction is a budding science fiction, historical fiction. And, I just want to speak up for the much maligned romance fiction.
Romance fiction, I think, is the hardest genre to write. I really believe this.
So back in my early days as a novelist, I met a young woman online who had written a Harlequin romance. And she said, I would like to send this to you. And I'm like, hey, sure, send it to me. And yes, it had to follow the formula in terms of when the lovers could get together. And yes, it had those interesting vocabulary choices. But the bottom line was that this woman had 5 couples who were all with the wrong person, and all had to get with the right person by the end of what was no more than a 220-page novel. I was like, I couldn't do this on a bet. This is so much harder, and it was so satisfying. And I think, I mean, romance has come a long way, in part because they're just more and more successful, interesting writers like Jasmine Guilfoyle and Sarah MacLean and Eloisa James has been there all along, the secret Shakespeare professor who's really the daughter of Robert Bly. And obviously Bridgerton helped a lot, you begin to, but I just can't stand it. It's one of the reasons Possession is one of my favorite novels, is because it has everything but science fiction in there. It's, it has a romance, it has a mystery, it's an academic satire. It has poetry, it has sort of like historical fiction about biographical figures. And so yeah, I had to get my shots in. I think that one of the things I really always want to be clear on is that I am not wistfully walking past the lunch table where the literary writers sit and hoping they'll ask me to sit down. I feel like I could sit there if I wanted to, but I like crime fiction. I chose really well. I'm interested in crime. I still like to talk about the time that Megan Abbott, Gillian Flynn, and I basically brought the Key West Literary Festival to its knees by doing a panel on how much we unironically love Lifetime movies.
That was truly one of the greatest panels I've ever watched later on. But
They're
yes.
like, what do you want to talk about? I'm like, no, we love Lifetime movies because they center women. And I don't think people understood. I mean, Gillian really kicked the doors off. It was a great thing when Gone Girl came along. And okay, God, circling back to men. I can barely hold it together when I hear men complaining that they can't get published, or maybe I'll just have to change my name, to a woman's name, or a gender neutral name. And I just like, guys, maybe just try to write something new. Because I think one of the things I noticed about the most successful crime writers working today, and this is in both genders and along every identity spectrum, nobody is doing what they were doing 15 years ago. Everyone's doing something. No, should they? I mean, can you imagine if you showed up? I'm doing this 25 years. Can you imagine if you showed up for your job evaluation 25 years in, and they're like, you're doing exactly what you were doing 25 years ago, exactly the way you did it then, and that's just great. No. All the really interesting writers, the people I admire, are changing up, trying different things. And by the way, sometimes trying television, trying film.
Yeah.
People are becoming showrunners. And I think that's glorious. And, I'm really proud to be a crime novelist. As you know, Sarah, gosh, maybe a month ago, it was our assumption that you and I would have this conversation. And the next day I would fly to, and I would fly to BoucherCon.
Yeah.
And our conference was canceled this year, as it should have been.
Yes.
In New Orleans. That was the right call. It's the best thing for, these besieged cities and everybody not to tax much needed services. But you just know we were going to get there, and there are going to be some 60-year-old white dudes in the bar, like, complaining because people don't want to read what they want to write, and they can't open their minds to the idea that maybe they should try to write something different.
All I'll say to that is that I've read a number of crime novels, some of which I've reviewed, some of which I will review, that are by white guys that are really good.
Yes, there are some.
And those are the ones that the disgruntled ones should be reading.
Yeah, they should, and they should pay attention.
Absolutely.
You look at someone like Lee Child, and I know Lee has kind of handed the reins of his series over to his brother. Lee tried new things. Lee kept it fresh. And Reacher himself, Lee and I published the same first year. Right. Next year will be Lee's 25th anniversary too. Reacher felt really fresh and new. And Lee obviously was committed to never losing that feeling. Or you look at someone like Michael Connelly. Michael Connelly has shown a willingness to do things differently, take risks, find a way to create Bosch as a TV series by never being complacent. And Mike sits at the top of the genre. Mike could probably write a book every year, and it would be number one. But I so admire the people who won't coast on their reputations.
Exactly. So I'm going to look at some of the questions that have come up. This one is from Miriam, and she asks, how do you create and maintain the psychological tension and terror throughout Dreamgirl?
Well, I make these crazy charts for every book, or these crazy like artworks almost. And with Dreamgirl, I have to say, I know some people have said, have you heard that some people on the internet were complaining about this? I was like, no, I have not. Thank you for bringing it to my attention. Apparently, some people said they had trouble with the book jumping around in time. And I was like, but that's how our memories work. I don't have these nice, tidy memories that just move along in linear fashion. And I was really interested in showing the deterioration of Jerry's mental state and how the memories became, the prompts for the memories become more and more obscure as the book goes on. And I was very aware of, it's a 2-part book, but I think it does have 3 acts. And I was working to the very end on the right timing of each revelation that establishes more and more that Jerry's really a pretty terrible person.
Yeah.
And, let me just talk about this without giving a spoiler. The worst thing Jerry does in the book, like something that was actually kind of stomach churning and is the hardest chapter I've ever read in my life in a hotel room, that happens to a woman. But I feel like the thing that in the end feels the most shocking is what he does to a male friend.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the final shoe to drop on the awfulness of Jerry Anderson. And it took me, it was not always that way. And I had to, use my cards and my colors and my charts and my chutes and ladders to kind of stuff. So, I mean, I never say that I did it, but I was very conscious of it. And I was, I had a calendar. I had to know, and at some point it was like, well, Jerry's not going to know what day it is anymore. So what's going on now and how does that work? And I think the chapters are pretty short from relative to what I normally do. The chapters, and there are just a lot of traditional kind of cliffhangers. Yeah. Where you get to the end of a chapter and oh, there's a body on the floor. What are we going to do now?
You got to do something. So this question is from Jerry, which is, do you usually have an idea for a next book before finishing one? And do you have a method for coming up with new ideas?
I certainly have a little tickler file. I'm very amused because I have a book that I've been thinking about writing for years called Find Me. And now our good friend Alistair Burke has a book coming out called Find Me.
Find Me, I know.
Well, I won't be using that title. Thank you very much, Alistair. And I started working on that book after I finished Dream Girl. But one of the things I've done, so when I started, I was working full time and it was really hard to write a book a year and I couldn't really afford to have any downtime. And it was just sort of I turned a book in, I started a new book. Oh, here's the edits. Okay, put that, just always working, always working. I now allow myself to work on only one book at a time. And I purposely don't think about the next book until I'm through galleys. I want to keep one book in my head. I want to be totally living that book. Dream Girl was interrupted by the essay book at my publisher's behest. It was I had to put Dream Girl aside for 2 months to write new material for the essay book. And that felt very weird. And, but when I got back to Jerry in late fall of 2019, I was actually really happy to be back in that book. I'm not precious about idea generation. I don't think it should be mysterious or hard. I just sit down with a pad and I kind of think, what am I interested in? What's really on my mind right now? And, I walk every day, which is something I made a big deal about on Twitter. And I listen to a lot of podcasts. And I was listening to You're Wrong About, and it was a podcast about what they called prom moms.
Yes.
First of all, it was prom mom. There's a title. And I knew I was interested, not so much in the phenomenon of that moment, but when I did a little bit of research, I found out that there was one young couple who was involved in one of these tragedies who later in their adulthood became friends on Facebook. That was very interesting to me. But what I realized recently, and I've been working on this book for a while, is that what I'm really interested in on this book is taking this 1990s trope of the popular guy and the outsider girl and looking at how it is much more likely to not end up as a happily ever after. I'm really interested in this concept of there's a really great guy and he's handsome and he's popular, but inside he's somebody else and therefore he yearns for this girl. And, you know, I recently watched She's All That with my daughter, and I'd never seen it before. And I'm like, oh, this is totally, so, you know, it's like, I kind of pay attention to what's interesting to me. I'm just like, I'm pretty normal. I'm a relatively normal person. If I find this, and I think one of the things that really jumped out at me about Prom Mom, Sarah Marshall, who's become sort of my phone friend in the pandemic, she talked about how plausible it was that a teenage girl could not know she was pregnant. She's like, your body's a complete mystery to you. Anything could be happening, and you're so in denial. And so I was really interested in this idea of a smart girl who just really can't believe she's gotten herself into this much trouble, and, you know, wanting to follow the idea from there. And I'm God, knock wood, I don't believe in writer's block. And I think because I don't feel like I have to come up with a totally original idea, because I don't believe in totally original ideas, I don't ever feel too nervous about it. I just get out my legal pad and just start doodling and thinking and paying attention to what's interesting in the culture right now.
So I think we have time for one more, which comes in from Robin, who I should shout out. I used to work with Robin at Publishers Marketplace, and that's really cool that she's here. Has your daughter read any of your books yet? And how do you feel about that?
My daughter has not read any of my novels. I would not want her to read my novels until she's considerably older. Maybe, I mean, I'd have to go back and look at some of the Tess Monahan books. I don't have, I'm not very puritanical, but there is a lot of violence. There are some things that I think would be upsetting to her. She's a very imaginative kid, a very vivid imagination. I don't need to be planting some of these images in her dreams. I would actually like her to read one of my short stories because it's so obviously based on her, and it's in the next collection. It's called The Book Thing. It's one of my stories that has no homicide in it, you know, and it's about, it was inspired by a very real place in Baltimore where you could just get books for free. It was called The Book Thing. And it's the kid in the book, Tess Monahan's daughter. Tess Monahan's daughter is clearly based on my kid. And it's such a little time capsule of what my daughter was like when she was like 2.5, 3. And when I was doing the copy edit, it meant a lot to me that, you know, I was like, this is like as good as any photo album I could have put together. You know, Carla Scout, Tess's daughter, is also very prominent in the novel Hush Hush.
Yeah. And
I got a letter from a reader talking about what a loathsome child she was. And
that must have been so wounding.
It was, but I wrote back and I said, you know, I really appreciate you taking time to write me. And I get that, yeah, in this book, Carla Scout is pretty irritating, but it's just a snapshot. She won't always be irritating. And, you know, I will tell you that this was inspired by my kid, but it's okay. It's like, I'm not mad. It was, I mean, I think the scene I wrote in which Tess Monahan is trying to figure out if she has time to buy a bottle of wine before her kid reaches full tantrum in the grocery store aisle. I mean, I feel like that's one of the most universal scenes I've ever written in my life. But Georgia Ray did collaborate with me on the short story about Carla Scout.
Yeah. And so what was it like being a collaborator with her?
It was good. You know, she wanted more control than I was willing to cede. I was like, look, you're here for authenticity. You're going to help me write a credible 11-year-old in 2020. But when it comes to plotting, sweetie, when it comes to plotting, you just got to let mama do that. It's like, trust me, I'm good at this, honey. I really am. And she did understand when I would explain different parts of what we were doing, why the story had to go that way.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So I think, so we are out of time. And
oh my God.
Laura, it was such a pleasure. And obviously we could go on for hours and probably will.
Well, another day, another time, another forum.
Exactly. And thank you all so much for attending this wonderful conversation. And we love indie bookstores of all kinds all around the country and the world. So thank you so much.
Baltimore's been really lucky to see a renaissance of indie bookstores. We have the Ivy, we have Greedy Reads, we have Red Emma, we have the Book Escape. I'm forgetting some. I mean, that's how cool. It's so cool that Baltimore now has enough independent bookstores that I can't name them all off the top of my head like that.
That says it all in and of itself. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Good night, all. Thank
Bye.
you.